Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are not just talking about politics. We're not talking about polls or, who said what on social media yesterday.
Right. This is bigger.
Much bigger. We are, in a way, staring into a crack in the foundation of the world as we know it. We're talking about a concept that goes way, way beyond a simple transition of power. We are talking about a rupture.
It's a heavy word, isn't it? Rupture.
It is.
It implies something
That's it.
violent, something breaking. A transition is like a bridge. You walk from one side to the other.
Right.
A rupture is when the bridge just snaps.
Exactly. And to help us navigate this, we are diving into a really intense, high-level conversation. It's between Preet Bharara,
Who is a former U.S. attorney, just an incredibly sharp legal mind.
right, and Anne Applebaum. Now, for anyone who doesn't have her on their bookshelf yet, you should. She is basically the historian you call when you want to understand how democracies die.
That's a good way to put it. She wrote Autocracy Inc. She's an expert on authoritarian regimes, especially in Eastern Europe. And she doesn't sugarcoat things.
No, she certainly doesn't. And what makes this specific conversation so vital and, frankly, a little chilling is that they aren't just discussing policy disputes.
Not at all.
They're analyzing the argument that we've moved past the point of normal political oscillation, back and forth. The core premise here actually comes from a speech by Mark Carney at Davos, which Applebaum references.
Right, Davos,
Yeah.
the World Economic Forum. And, usually that's the place where people go to talk about interest rates and carbon credits in these very polite, very hushed tones.
Exactly. It's very safe.
Very safe. But Carney stands up and says something that just, I imagine, sucked the air out of the room. He said that we are not in a transition. We are in a rupture, a fundamental break in the timeline.
A break in the timeline.
Yes. The argument is that the institutions that hold the U.S., and by extension the entire global order together, are not just being reshaped. They are, in a word, being smashed.
Okay, I want to pause there because it sounds dramatic. We hear this is the end of the world as we know it every 4 years, right? Every election is the most important election of our life.
Of course. There's always a level of hyperbole.
Right. Usually when we talk about politics, even when it's heated, we frame it as a pendulum. It swings left, it swings right, sometimes it swings a little too far, but it's still attached to the same clock.
Right.
But what Applebaum is saying here is that the clock is off the wall.
She's saying the clock is being dismantled, gear by gear. The stakes here, according to the source material, are really about the permanence of these systemic changes. This isn't about tax rates going up or down.
Or zoning laws.
Exactly. It is about whether the rule of law, the independence of the civil service, and the very concept of objective truth can survive.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really look at three main things. First, we need to dig into this idea that the current political movement in the U.S. is radical, not conservative. And I want to challenge that because words matter.
They absolutely do.
Second, we're going to look at the psychological mechanism, what they call the greatest trick, that makes people accept this slow erosion of their own rights.
How it happens without people panicking.
Yes. And third, we're going to look at some very specific and, frankly, very disturbing case studies, specifically regarding the use of force in Minnesota and what that signals not just to Americans, but to the entire world.
It is a lot to get through, but it's crucial. This isn't just a list of complaints. It's an anatomy of how a system can begin to collapse.
Okay, let's start with definitions then. Because Applebaum makes this really interesting point early on where she says we have to stop calling the Trump administration and this movement conservative. She says that is a total category error.
Yes.
But I have to play devil's advocate here. I mean, to a lot of people, aren't they the definition of conservative? They want to go back to a perceived past. They appoint conservative judges. Why does she say that label is just plain wrong?
It's a very common and, understandable category error. To get why she says that, we have to look at political philosophy for a second. We tend to use conservative and Republican interchangeably in the U.S., but historically, they are distinct ideas.
Okay.
Applebaum argues that true conservatism, what's called Burkian conservatism, after the philosopher Edmund Burke, is about, it's about conserving.
Right. It's right there in the name.
It is. A true conservative looks at institutions, the courts, the Department of Justice, the norms of Congress, and says, let's move slowly here. Let's be careful. Let's not smash things up, because rebuilding them is incredibly, incredibly difficult.
It's a philosophy of caution.
Exactly. A conservative sees a fence and says, don't tear that down until you know precisely why it was put up in the first place. It's about stability. preservation.
Okay, so that's the classical definition.
Right. Now compare that to what's described in the source. Applebaum uses the comparison that I have to admit might sound like hyperbole at first.
Go on.
She compares the current mentality not to Reagan or Bush, but to the Bolsheviks.
Whoa, hold on. The Bolsheviks. As in Lenin and Trotsky. The communists. That seems like a stretch, given that the movement we're talking about is hyper-capitalist.
And that's the key distinction. She isn't talking about their economic policy at all. She is talking about their revolutionary tactics.
Or methods.
Precisely. Think about what the Bolsheviks did in Russia. They weren't interested in reforming the Tsar's government. They didn't want to just tweak the laws to make them fairer.
They wanted to burn it all down.
They wanted to smash the existing order entirely. They wanted what historians call year zero.
Year zero, what does that mean?
It's the idea that you destroy all existing institutions, you break all conventions, you tear up all the rules, and then you build something totally new on the rubble. Applebaum's argument is that the current administration's approach to governance is radical in that same sense.
So it's not a desire to fix things, it's a desire to break things.
Exactly. It is a desire to destroy the checks and balances that exist. A conservative wants to fix the Department of Justice. A radical wants to break its knees so it can never walk again.
So when we see things that look chaotic, or when we see norms being shattered left and right, the argument is that this isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's not bad governance, it's anti-governance.
You've got it. And the source material highlights specific mechanisms of this destruction. It isn't just rhetoric. Applebaum points to the disregard for the rule of law as the primary engine here.
For instance,
allowing federal agents, specifically, she talks about those working with or for IC to operate with a kind of impunity.
this was a huge part of the discussion. The idea that you have agents who can attack or even kill without a real, transparent investigation.
Or the casual acceptance of massive conflicts of interest. We're talking direct payments to Trump companies that would have been completely unthinkable in any previous administration, Republican or Democrat.
It would have been a career-ending scandal.
Instantly. Or another example, cabinet secretaries fundamentally changing the rules of their own organizations, just destroying entire programs without any congressional approval, without any legal basis, just doing it by fiat.
It's like taking the batteries out of the smoke detector while you're lighting a fire in the living room.
That's a good analogy. But a Bolshevik would go further. They would smash the smoke detector with a hammer because it represents a constraint on their freedom to burn things.
I see.
The goal, according to this analysis, isn't to run the house better. It is to consolidate power by dismantling the very things that stop you from doing whatever you want. That is the definition of radicalism. It is pulling the entire system up by the roots.
Okay, so if this is happening, if the roots are being pulled up, why aren't more people freaking out? I mean, why isn't everyone running around with their hair on fire? This brings us to the second big theme, the greatest trick.
This is one of the most psychologically fascinating parts of their whole discussion. They quote Ashley Parker, a journalist, who said something really profound.
What was it?
She said, "Among the greatest tricks Donald Trump ever pulled is convincing significant portions of the population that the slow erosion of their rights is not actually that big of a deal."
The classic boiling frog effect.
Essentially, yes. But Applebaum gives us a more specific mechanism for how it works. She compares what's happening in the U.S. to what happened in places like Hungary, Turkey, and Venezuela.
Okay.
See, we often have this very dramatic movie-style idea of how a democracy ends. You know, tanks rolling down the streets, a sudden military coup, everything changes overnight.
Right. The Death Star blows up the planet. It's a single big event.
Exactly. But in the modern era, that is very rarely how it actually happens. It's what's known as the salami tactic.
Salami tactic.
You just take one thin slice at a time. It's so thin you barely notice it.
Yeah.
Have leaders who are elected legitimately. This part is key. Orban in Hungary, Chavez in Venezuela,
Yeah.
they won elections.
They came to power through the system.
They did. But once they had that power, they used it to slowly, methodically chip away at the state.
How exact? Can you give me an example of a slice?
Absolutely. So take Hungary. Orban didn't just ban all the independent media overnight. That would cause an uproar. Instead, he just changed the regulations on who could own media companies, making it so only his friends and allies could afford the licenses. He didn't fire all the judges at once. He just lowered the mandatory retirement age for judges, forcing out hundreds of the older, more independent ones, and then he replaced them with his own loyalists.
That sounds boring. It sounds like bureaucracy.
That's the point. That's the trick. It sounds like administrative tweaking. It's not sexy. It doesn't make for an exciting headline. And at every single step, they convince their voters of two crucial things. First, you personally aren't losing anything.
And second,
Only the others are losing their rights.
and that's the real hook, isn't it? It's not happening to you. It's happening to the enemies. It's happening to the minorities, the immigrants, the liberals. So you stay quiet because you think you're safe.
Correct. And Applebaum makes a really alarming point here. She notes that the speed of this erosion in the U.S. has been much, much faster than in those historical precedents. In Hungary, it took about a decade to get to where they are now. In the U.S., the shattering of core norms, like the peaceful transfer of power, the refusal to accept election results, the open weaponization of the Justice Department, happened at a breakneck pace.
What does that suggest?
It suggests, and this is a tough pill to swallow, that a significant part of the population was already primed to accept it.
Primed? What do you mean by primed? Like they didn't care about the institutions in the first place?
Or that they actively agreed that the system wasn't worth saving. I mean, if you truly believe the entire system is rigged or corrupt or evil, then you don't mind seeing it get smashed. You cheer for the wrecking ball.
But this leads to a really practical political debate that Para brings up. He pushes back on Applebaum here, and honestly, I think a lot of our listeners might agree with his point.
It's the classic dilemma.
He says, okay, but Democrats always say you can't run a campaign on this democracy stuff. It's too esoteric. It's too abstract.
Right, the nobody eats the Constitution argument.
Exactly. If you go to a diner in Michigan or Pennsylvania, people are worried about the price of eggs. They're worried about their mortgage payment. If you start lecturing them about Burkian conservatism versus Bolshevik radicalism, their eyes are just going to glaze over.
That is absolutely the conventional wisdom. Don't talk about the rule of law, talk about jobs. But Applebaum completely rejects this binary choice. She says it's a false dichotomy.
How so?
Her argument is that you must connect the rule of law to people's daily lives. You have to show them that the corruption is a kitchen table issue.
She gave a really powerful example from Poland, right? Because Poland actually managed to turn this tide back recently.
Yes, the 2023 election in Poland. A pro-rule of law coalition actually won a surprise victory, and they didn't do it by giving abstract lectures on constitutional theory.
So what did they do?
They connected the illegal undermining of the courts to things ordinary people understood. They showed that when the government is corrupt and breaks the law, you pay for it.
Yeah.
Literally.
This is the corruption tax argument. I found this part fascinating. Break that down for us.
It's the idea that corruption isn't just a moral failing. It's expensive. It costs you money. It was a strategy used incredibly effectively by Alexei Navalny, the late Russian opposition leader.
Right.
He didn't just stand up and say, Putin is a dictator. He flew a drone over Putin's secret billion-dollar palace on the Black Sea. He showed the gold-plated toilet brushes. He showed the private casino.
He made it visual.
He made it concrete.
Yeah.
And he said, look at that. That is your money. That is the money from your taxes. That is why your local hospital doesn't have medicine. That is why the roads in your town are full of potholes. He stole it from you.
So it makes the abstract concrete. It hits you directly in the wallet.
Precisely. And Applebaum applies that same logic here in the U.S. context. She mentions the argument that the massive amount of money being poured into agencies like IC, essentially creating what she calls a private military, loyal only to the executive, is taxpayer money.
That's money that isn't going to healthcare.
It isn't going to schools. It isn't going to repairing that bridge in your town that you have to drive over every day.
It creates a direct, tangible line between authoritarian behavior and your personal bank account. If you allow brutality and the misuse of public funds, you are personally poorer for it.
It connects the esoteric to the tangible. And speaking of brutality, we really need to zoom in on that because this was the part of the transcript that really stuck with me. We're talking about the case study in Minnesota.
Yes.
Now, for context, Applebaum and Barra are discussing the deployment of federal agents, ICE and others, into American cities, often against the wishes of local governments.
This is a crucial section because it moves from the theoretical to the visceral. Applebaum describes the scene in Minneapolis, and it's so important to visualize what she's describing here. We are not talking about a high crime zone. We're not talking about a border crossing.
No, we are talking about ordinary, middle-class, suburban neighborhoods.
And the way she described the agents was just chilling. She said they were dressed for Fallujah or Ghazni province.
Let's be specific about what that means, because the image is everything. We are not talking about a police officer in a familiar blue uniform with a pistol on their hip.
No.
We were talking about men in unmarked camouflage fatigues, helmets, night vision goggles, full body armor, carrying M4 carbines, military-grade assault rifles,
And driving up in armored personnel carriers.
invading daycare centers and schools. The visual disconnect is the entire point. You have the imagery of a war zone occupation force superimposed on an American suburb.
And the crimes they were supposedly responding to, in some cases people holding up their phones to record them.
Yes. And Applebaum calls this performative cruelty. It wasn't just law enforcement doing a job. It was a show. It was a performance. The strategy, she argues, was designed for two audiences, to appeal to the base and to frighten everyone else.
It's theatrical.
Deeply theatrical. She references a previous raid in Chicago where they used Black Hawk helicopters on a single apartment building.
A Black Hawk helicopter on an apartment building in Chicago.
Yes. And here's the kicker. They filmed it. They filmed the raid and then had staff edit the footage into what she calls a video game-style clip for social media.
Oh, that's disturbing.
Fast cuts, dramatic music. It looked like a trailer for a new Call of Duty game. It turns state violence into entertainment, into content.
And what was the result of that raid?
It turned out the residents in that building were mostly U.S. citizens or non-criminals. A total bust. But the facts didn't matter. The footage mattered. The projection of dominance was the only thing that mattered.
But Applebaum suggests this strategy actually backfired in Minnesota.
It did.
Why there? Why didn't it work?
Because it was too much. It was too blatant. It looked like thugs attacking normal streets. Instead of looking tough on crime, it looked like a foreign invasion. And it provoked ordinary people, people who don't usually protest, people who would never consider themselves activists, to come out into the streets.
Because the violence was so offensive.
It was so out of place that it broke through the apathy. It ruptured their sense of normalcy.
It's that word again, rupture. But then comes a second part of the strategy, right? The narrative. Or let's be honest, the lies. Because when things go wrong, the machine turns on the victim.
This is where the machinery of the state turns against the individual citizen. They discussed specific victims, Renee Good and Alex Prey. And the case of Alex Prey is particularly illustrative of how indiscriminate this kind of radicalism can be.
Tell us about him.
Alex Prey worked for the VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs. He owned a gun, which is his constitutional right, but he wasn't carrying it at the time of the incident. He was, demographically speaking, someone you might assume would be sympathetic to the Trump base.
Right. A white guy, connection to veterans, a gun owner. He fits the profile of the forgotten man that Trump claims to represent.
Precisely. And yet, he was killed by federal agents. And immediately, I mean, before the facts were even known, before any real investigation could happen, the administration slandered him. They labeled the victims as domestic terrorists or gun-wielding maniacs.
That speed is what shocked Applebaum. She said that normally, in almost any other context, when a citizen is killed by the state, there's a pause. There's a moment of mourning, or at least a neutral statement like, we are investigating the incident.
Right, a moment of process.
But here, it was instant, aggressive propaganda against the dead.
It highlights a loss of what she calls decency. A fundamental human decency. And this transitions us perfectly into the broader cultural shift they discussed. It is not just about policy, it is about a coarsening of the entire culture.
This is section 4, the decency deficit. And Preet Para asks this question that I think a lot of us have asked ourselves. He references the downfall of Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Right.
You know, the famous moment in the 1950s Army McCarthy hearings where the lawyer, Joseph Welch, finally stands up to McCarthy's smears and says that immortal line. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
And that was it. That was the pin that popped the balloon. The entire room broke into applause. McCarthy's career never recovered. He had been publicly shamed.
And Farah asks, is that moment even possible today? Could anyone say anything to the current leadership that would make people snap out of it and say, that's too far?
And the answer they came to was,
Yeah.
well, it was depressing. The answer was likely no.
Why not?
Because the cultural category of decency may no longer be universally felt. We have to look at the drivers of this shift. Applebaum points to the internet and social media, of course, the constant desensitization.
We see millions of images of death and violence every day. We scroll past them while we're eating lunch. We just click and we move on.
Exactly. Our hearts have hardened, as she puts it. But it goes deeper than just being numb. Applebaum points out this really disturbing paradox.
Which is?
There are millions of people who view themselves as moral, upstanding citizens, people who wear button-down shirts, go to an office, go to church on Sundays, people who would never be cruel to their neighbor face to face.
Okay.
And yet, these same people are willing to overlook and even cheer for cruelty, corruption, and lies that would have previously been completely disqualifying at a public figure.
It's the acceptance of the unacceptable. But why? How do they justify that disconnect in their own
It
minds?
seems to be transactional. They've decided that the other side, the liberals, the globalists, the woke mob, whatever they call the enemy, is so existentially dangerous that any weapon used against them is justified. He may be a brute, but he's our brute.
And there are specific figures who exploit this. They discuss Stephen Miller in particular. Applebaum describes him as someone who uses language from the fascist or communist world, and he does it knowingly to break taboos.
He says the unsayable. He finds the line and deliberately crosses it.
And that appeals to a student psychology, doesn't it? It signals dominance. To the radical mindset, adhering to norms and being decent looks like weakness. Smashing conventions, saying the racist thing, the cruel thing, the illegal thing, that signals strength.
It signals that you are not bound by the rules that bind everyone else.
That is a terrifying definition of strength.
It is the definition of strength in an autocracy. Which brings us to the global stage, because this rupture isn't just happening inside U.S. borders. It is breaking the entire post-World War II order.
This is Section 5. And this is where we go right back to that rupture concept from Mark Carney. We aren't just transitioning to a new foreign policy. We are breaking the fundamental relationships that built the modern world.
Let's talk about NATO. For decades, NATO has been the absolute bedrock of Western security. Applebaum argues that the alliance is now fundamentally changed.
In what way?
Now, interestingly, she notes that at the operational level, generals talking to generals, soldiers doing joint exercises, things are still functioning. Plans are being made.
Right, so the gears are still turning. The machine is still running on some level.
But the trust at the executive level, at the presidential and prime ministerial level, it's gone. The rupture is in the reliability. No one knows if the U.S. will honor its commitments from one day to the next.
She talked about the loss of soft power. And I think people sometimes roll their eyes at that term like it's just some diplomatic fluff, but she made it really concrete. She asked, why did people all over the world buy U.S. airplanes? Why did they buy U.S. goods?
It wasn't just about quality, though that was part of it. It was because they wanted a relationship with the protector country.
Explain that.
Being economically tied to the U.S. was a security guarantee. It was a form of insurance. If you buy Boeing jets for your airline, you are buying a piece of the American security umbrella. If the U.S. is no longer seen as the stable protector, but as a source of instability or as a bully, that economic preference just evaporates.
And she compared this whole situation to Brexit.
Yes, the slow burn theory. This is critical for listeners to understand. We often expect economic consequences to be a huge explosion, a stock market crash the day after a bad decision is made.
Right.
But Applebaum says, look at the UK after Brexit. There wasn't a sudden explosion.
No, London didn't fall into the Thames.
Not at all. But over a decade, there has been a slow, grinding loss of momentum. Investment dried up. Businesses quietly moved their headquarters to Paris or Frankfurt. The British economy it shrank. It got grayer. It became less relevant on the world stage.
That's a scary thought. Not a bang, but a whimper. Just a slow decline into irrelevance.
And we are seeing the beginning of that with this concept of de-risking. Now, usually when economists and diplomats talk about de-risking, they mean de-risking from China.
Right.
For years, Europe has been talking about how they need to reduce their dependence on China because the Chinese government might weaponize trade or cut off critical supply chains. Don't put all your eggs in the Beijing basket.
Makes sense.
But now, Applebaum says, European leaders are openly discussing the need to de-risk from the United States.
Wow. Just let that sink in for a moment. Our closest allies are actively trying to make sure they aren't dependent on us because we are seen as too unstable.
It's exactly.
Like avoiding dependence on U.S. tech, avoiding U.S. supply chains. Because if a U.S. administration decides to weaponize trade against its own allies, putting massive tariffs on French wine because the president got mad at Macron, for example, Europe needs to be insulated, that is a massive seismic shift. That is the rupture.
I want to touch on one specific factual point they brought up, because you hear it all the time. The idea that Europe doesn't pay its fair share for NATO.
All the time.
Trump says it constantly. And Barra played devil's advocate and asked, is there a kernel of truth there? Because to the average American listening, it does kind of seem like we pay for everything.
And Applebaum shut that down, and she did it quite effectively with facts. She pointed out two key things. First, U.S. military spending is so high because of global power projection. We have massive bases in the Pacific, in the Middle East, in Africa. Europe doesn't do that.
Right.
That is a U.S. choice made for U.S. interests. If you look at military spending in Europe, specifically for the defense of Europe, the Europeans are actually well ahead. So we're paying to be the global superpower, not just to defend Germany from Russia.
Correct. And second, and this is the really powerful point, she mentioned Article 5. That's an attack on one is an attack on all clause in the NATO treaty. Do you know the only time Article 5 has ever been invoked in the entire history of NATO?
It was after 9/11.
Exactly. To defend the United States,
Right.
Europeans sent their soldiers to Afghanistan and Iraq. They died there, thousands of them,
Yeah.
at great political cost to their own leaders at home because those wars were deeply unpopular in Europe.
Right.
So to have that sacrifice dismissed and lied about as not paying their fair share is, in her view, not just a factual error, but a deep moral betrayal of the alliance.
Yeah.
It insults the memory of those soldiers.
That really puts it in perspective. And it goes back to that Autocracy Inc. concept you mentioned earlier. The new breed of autocrats, Putin, Xi, Trump, they're different from the old Soviet leaders, aren't they?
This is a fascinating evolution, she points out. The old Soviet leaders, for all their monstrous faults, pretended to care about their image on the world stage. They claimed their system was more just, more lawful. They signed treaties and then pretended to honor them.
They cared about hypocrisy.
Yes, they wanted to look legitimate. Modern autocrats don't care about hypocrisy. In fact, they brag about breaking the rules. It's a feature, not a bug.
It's the might makes right philosophy just out in the open.
Putin invaded Ukraine partly to demonstrate that he could ignore borders, treaties, and human rights laws with impunity. It was a flex. And Applebaum argues Trump shares this exact psychology. Breaking the law isn't something to hide, it's something to display. It empowers him and it frightens his opponents.
And his foreign policy isn't strategic in a traditional sense. It's narcissistic.
It's all about personal perception. Am I seen as a winner? Do I look strong? The example she gives of him trying to buy Greenland.
Oh, God, I had almost forgotten about Greenland. That felt like a fever dream.
It sounds funny, but it's deeply indicative. It wasn't a strategic geopolitical move based on national interest. It was a real estate developer trying to make a big, flashy splash. And when it didn't work, when the Danes said no, he got angry and turned on an ally. It's foreign policy as personal psychodrama.
So we have a domestic rupture radicalism, erosion of rights, performative cruelty. We have a global rupture loss of trust, de-risking from our allies. Where does that leave the future of democracy itself? This brings us to the final section.
This is where the conversation turns really philosophical. We in the West often think of democracy as the default setting for humanity and autocracy as the strange aberration.
Right. It's the end of history idea.
Exactly. But Applebaum reminds us, historically, democracy is a tiny blip on the radar.
A blip.
Most of human history's warlords, kings, pharaohs, and emperors. Democracy is unusual. It's fragile. It relies on very specific conditions, Enlightenment thinking, a certain kind of information ecosystem, and yes, that word again, decency. It relies on the voters ultimately rejecting a bad person.
The Founding Fathers assumed that, didn't they? They put in the Electoral College, the Senate, all these checks and balances.
They did. They built a system of checks, but they ultimately assumed that the electorate, or at least the elites who chose the president, would possess enough civic virtue to reject an obvious demagogue. They didn't fully account for a system or a media environment that could propel a characterologically unfit person to the top, despite those flaws, maybe even because of them.
They assumed shame was a powerful political force.
And they may have been wrong, but, and here's the glimmer of hope in the conversation, or at least a different perspective, autocracy is fragile too.
How so?
It is. Autocracy relies on violence and fear precisely because it lacks legitimacy. It can look incredibly stable, like a solid block of ice, right up until the moment it shatters. It doesn't bend, it breaks.
Right. Look at the Soviet Union. It seemed eternal and monolithic until very suddenly it wasn't.
Exactly. Democracy, at least in theory, can bend. It has a built-in succession process. It allows for correction. If you make a mistake, you can vote the mistake out in 4 years.
So democracy is harder to maintain day to day, but it's more resilient in the long run if you can keep it. Autocracy looks strong on the surface, but is secretly brittle.
Precisely. The urgent question is whether our democracy has now become too brittle to survive the current hammering it's taking.
So let's try to wrap this all up. What does this all mean for us? We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. To recap the key insights from our conversation. First, we need to reframe our understanding of what's happening. It is not conservative. It is radical. It is Bolshevik in its desire to smash institutions to clear the way for raw power.
Second, don't fall for the slow erosion trap. The boiling frog is real. Just because it's happening slowly or just because it's happening to someone else first doesn't mean your rights aren't evaporating as we speak.
And third, the global shift is real, and it is happening now. We are moving from a world of change through trade, the old idea that doing business together creates peace, to a world where trade is weaponized and trust is broken, perhaps for a generation.
And here is the final provocative thought I want to leave all of you with, based on this deep dive. We talked about Rupture, and Applebaum mentioned Rome, after Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The Republic didn't disappear overnight. They still had a Senate, they still had elections of a sort, but it wasn't a republic anymore. It had fundamentally changed into an empire.
The forms remained, but the substance was gone. The question is, if the U.S. has truly ruptured its relationships and its own internal norms, can it ever go back? Even if the administration changes, the precedent has been set, the taboos have been broken. Can you really put that genie back in the bottle? Can you unsmash the vase?
Or have we, like Rome, already crossed our own Rubicon without even fully realizing it? And on a personal level, look for that slow chipping away in your own observation of current events.
Yeah.
When you see a norm broken, a lie told, a cruelty performed, do you shrug? Do you just scroll past that reaction, that numbness that is the rupture happening inside of you?
That's the greatest trick of all.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. Keep your eyes open.
And stay informed.
We'll see you next time.